Okay, one of the biggest goals that I know from a lot of the business owners I work with is to create a lasting legacy. And a lot of times they want to do this through passing the business down to future generations. And it's a great strategy. However, it's important to ask yourself two questions if this is the route you want to go down. Number one is, does that next generation even want to take over the business? And I would say, secondly, the most important is, do they even know how to run the business? In a lot of cases, business owners just automatically assume that their son, their daughter, and in some cases, their grandkids know and understand how to build teams, how to build processes, and how to grow a business. And that may not always be the case. Just because they go to college doesn't necessarily mean they know how to run a business. So I'm going to tell you a couple quick stories on some examples of both happy endings and then also some challenging and unfortunate situations that can come up when you do look at the option of passing the business down to family. So I'm going to give you a quick story about Bob. Bob owned a very successful roofing company. In fact, he started it back when he was only 22 years old. He was a roofer himself, had built up the skill set, and eventually started his own roofing company. And he had built this over the last 15 years and was at a point where he was ready to take the next step. So naturally, he looked within his family. He had three kids. He had his daughter, Megan, he had his son, Tim, and he had his other son, Michael. And out of all three of them, he was really hopeful that Michael, who was the youngest, was going to be the one to take over the business. He already knew that Megan wanted to do something else. She wasn't interested in the business. Tim, although he worked in the business, wasn't something that he was looking at doing long term. Mike, on the other hand, was the individual that he wanted to basically take over the business. He had gone to college, had gotten a degree in business administration, and he felt that he had the right tools in place to be able to take the company to the next level. So what Bob did is he spent a lot of time trying to figure out the best strategy on how to exit the business. He had talked to a couple different advisors, they'd given him differing opinions, but ultimately he settled on a strategy that would allow him to finance the business sale through the cash flow of the business. And he did this through the I'm going to walk you through a quick example of how passing your business down to your family may not work out as well as you think it is going to work out. I'm going to tell you a little story about Bob. Bob owned a very successful roofing company. In fact, he had started the company when he was only 25 years old. He had jumped right into the trade just shortly after high school, learned it, and did what most successful entrepreneurs do, is he took the risk and started his own company. But as Bob was turning 58, he quickly realized that this wasn't something that he wanted to continue to do for the rest of his life. In fact, he had three kids, and he was hoping to pass this business down to that next generation so that he could step aside and do some other things that he was wanting to do outside of the business. So naturally, he looked at his three children to try to determine who was going to be the best fit to continue the legacy of this roofing business. Now, he had three kids. His first one, which was his oldest, was Megan. Now, he knew Megan right off the bat was probably not going to be interested in running the business. She was very much into art and had a very successful career where she wasn't even in the same city in which the business was founded. His next son was Tim, and Tim was very successful, but he was in the business, but really couldn't show the passion of what he wanted to do staying in the business. So he was going to do something different. So last but not least was Michael. Michael was Bob's youngest son. He was the one that Bob felt was going to be the most capable to run the business because he had shown a lot of dedication to his schoolwork, had gone through college, got a degree in business administration, had worked in the business a little bit, but more importantly, Bob felt like he had the knowledge base to continue to run the business. So Bob sat down with Michael, they had a conversation, and Michael was super excited. He said, "Yes, Dad, I really want to run the business. I would love to take this business to the next level. There's a lot of technology out there that I think we can implement that would double the revenue of the business and continue to grow it to higher and higher heights." So Bob did the right thing. He sat down with his financial planner, walked through a couple different scenarios, and found the best way to pass the business down was through seller financing. This would allow Michael to come up with a very small amount up front and allow him to make payments to Bob through the cash flow of the business. So as long as Michael continued to do what he thought was going to continue to build the business, Bob would be set because he'd be collecting these checks each and every year to support his lifestyle after he exited the business. So enter Michael. Michael comes into the business. 1 year in, he's excited, he's jumping in, he's changing this, changing that, implementing technology, but he starts to rubbing some of the key employees the wrong way. Now, a lot of the employees had been there for many years, had been stuck in their ways, and didn't really embrace a lot of the changes that Michael was making. So Michael pretty much had put a policy in place, which was either get on the bus or get off. What ended up happening is there was a lot of key employees that left the company. That's fine. Michael went out and recruited some A players from other companies to come in. Michael quickly got overwhelmed because he tried to take so much onto his plate, wasn't doing a very good job delegating, and as a result, he had even those A players leave the company. Now, this left the company in a complete flux. And instead of the business actually increasing revenue, the revenue started to decrease because he lost a lot of his key employees and the technology that he had implemented was not working as he had anticipated. So over the next 2 to 3 years, the business started struggling a lot. Year 2, the cash flow of the business was not enough for Michael to be able to pay Bob on the seller's note. So Bob started to get a little bit worried because he was relying on that for his retirement income. So Bob was kind of holding off. He wanted to jump in and help Michael, but at the same time, he wanted to, enjoy his second life outside of the business. Here comes year 3. Cash flow drops even more. Michael misses another payment on the seller's note. Now Bob's really getting concerned. He starts getting involved in the business just to monitor how the cash flow of the business is coming along. The business continues to tank and it's getting faster and faster and faster. Michael, at this point, he can't handle it, talks to Bob, says, Dad, I need to step out of the business. This is too much for me. I can't do this anymore. So here's Bob, 3 years into his retirement. Now he's got to turn in and jump right back into the business. He has a big hole to dig out of. So in this scenario, Bob thought this was going to be a great solution, passing this down to his son Michael, being able to start his new chapter in his life, having steady income coming in, as well as looking at Michael to grow that business to the next level. What Bob was ended up with is he had a short-term retirement, had to jump right back in the business, and it took him about 5 years just to get the business back to where it was when he left. So it's not always a great idea in terms of looking at ways to pass down. Another area that I see business owners really struggle with is understanding how much they need as it relates to retirement and enjoying the next stage in life. A lot of times they're so busy focused on growing the business that they don't even think about themselves. So I'm going to give you a couple scenarios, a couple stories of some individuals, one that was successful, one that wasn't so successful. Okay. One of the common missteps that I see happen a lot with business owners is not understanding what their number is. And when I say number, that's going to be the number that they need to retire comfortably and enjoy the lifestyle that they want to have in their next chapter of their life. In a lot of cases, business owners, they're so focused in their business trying to grow it, they don't really think about what they're going to need in terms of a dollar amount to be able to enjoy that lifestyle. And there's a couple different important things that you want to consider when you are looking at coming up with that number. First and foremost, it's being able to sit down and financially plan and understand what your goals and dreams are. The second part of it is taxes. Now, when you go to sell your business, there's a good chance that you're going to have a nice little tax hit there. So you want to make sure that you calculate that into your number as well. A lot of business owners think that because they sell their business for $10 million, it means they're going to get $10 million. In reality, you may get only $6 million. You may have 40% of that $10 million. I'm going to tell you a quick story about Doug. Doug had a very successful business. In fact, he had grown his business to a valuation of right around $15 million. And Doug thought, that's plenty of money. I don't need to do any planning. If I get a check for $15 million, I can ride off into the sunset, accomplish my goals, my dreams, and be able to have the lifestyle that I want. So Doug went down the process of selling his company. Super excited. He got to the closing table. They closed the deal. He was looking for that $15 million check, and all he got was $7.5 million. You see, what Doug didn't realize is that the the sale that he did of the business was only half upfront in cash. The other half was on a 3-year earnout. And this 3-year earnout was essentially set with targets that were so high, the chances of Doug being able to achieve those targets to get the remaining earnout was going to be virtually impossible. So on top of that, when Doug sat down, he said, that's fine, $7.5 million, I can make that work. But at the end of the year, he got a nice tax bill. And that tax bill was roughly right around $3 million. So at the end of the day, Doug walked away with $4.5 million. He said, no problem, I can still make that work. There's just a few vacations that we won't be able to take, and maybe we won't be able to buy that second home that we were looking forward to doing. But I'm okay, my lifestyle is fairly modest, no problem. What Doug didn't realize is that he was only 58 years old. And so when he finally sat down with a financial planner to make sure this time that he was going to be able to have the right lifestyle, to have the right planning in place to generate income, Doug quickly figured out that $4.5 million was not going to be enough. In fact, in this plan, Doug would actually run out of money before he even hit age 80. So immediately, the financial planner and Doug had to sit down and start cutting certain expenses from the plan that he had built. And on top of that, he didn't hit the earnout. So 3 years later, that's $7.5 million that he was banking on out the window. He was left at the end of the day with only $4 million. So this is a great example of why it's so important that you need to understand what your number is and to make sure that you work with the right advisor so that that $15 million doesn't turn into $4 million. And that is something that is an unfortunate situation that in this case, Doug had to learn the hard way. Another story. I'm going to tell you another story about Mike. Now, Mike did this the right way. Mike had a very successful company. In this case, the business value of his company was only $10 million. So it was less than Doug's. So Mike was a little nervous. He wasn't sure if that was going to be able to be enough to be able to achieve his goals and the lifestyle that he wanted post-exit. So what he did is he engaged in working with a financial planner. And this financial planner sat down, went over Mike's goals, what he wanted to do long term to try to come up with the most appropriate plan, not only for the number, but the appropriate exit. In this case, Mike was getting ready to sell his business, and he was very concerned about taxes. He didn't want to make sure that he hit with taxes all at once. In fact, for now, he had a good amount of income coming in from his investment portfolio to basically offset any type of income that he would get from the business sale. So he engaged the right team. In this case, the financial planner brought in the M&A team, the investment banker that would come in and market the business, brought in the appropriate CPA to talk about different tax planning that he can do in order to successfully exit the business and pay the least amount of taxes. So here's what ended up happening. So as Mike got ready, the first thing his investment banker did is negotiate a great deal as it relates to getting as much as possible cash up front. In this case, it was a strategic buyer that wanted to purchase Mike's business. So the other thing that the investment banker did, which was very powerful, is understand the mechanics of why a strategic buyer will pay more for the business than any other buyer out there. In this case, the strategic buyer was going to be able to easily move Mike's business into their existing business and create efficiencies that would save costs. So ultimately, it would actually double the amount of net profit from purchasing Mike's business. That being said, his $10 million valuation on his business actually turned into $20 million. So to Mike's surprise, he was super excited about that. However, as we talked about before, he was in a little bit of a high tax situation. And so he wanted to make sure that that $20 million wasn't going to be completely reduced by taxes. So we sat down and we talked about different strategies to be able to avoid that. And so in this case, what we were able to do is negotiate not only the higher value, but the other attractive component of this to the strategic buyer is that Mike was going to take some seller financing to offload some of the additional value that he was getting from the sale of the business. So in this case, it wasn't a lot. He took a $5 million note and got $15 million cash up front. So what Mike was able to do is reduce his taxes by a considerable amount by taking less upfront and taking the $5 million over a period of time. That allowed him to spread his tax liability and not have to pay all of it at once. Now, when he sat down with his financial planner, they ran the numbers. Everything looked fantastic. Mike was able to achieve all his goals, live his lifestyle, and be able to continue the legacy that he had built for himself and for his family.